Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to Syracuse Sports. My name is Brent Axe. It is great to have you here as Emily Leiker and I are going to go back into the past, the not-so-distant past. What we're going to do over the next couple of weeks is look back at the 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023 recruiting/transfer classes for Syracuse football. Did these players meet expectation? Were they overvalued? Were they undervalued? You're certainly going to find names in all of those categories. We're going to kind of jog your memory a little bit. Like, where did these classes end up? We always hear about these rankings and everything, and then nobody goes back and actually sees how they ended up. It's almost like regrading a draft from 4 or 5 years ago. We're going to do that over these last 4 recruiting classes for Syracuse football, which will be interesting, of course, with Fran Brown taking over. He's been active in the transfer portal. He has certainly had a lot of success recruiting for Syracuse football. The 2025 commits keep on coming for the Orange. So let's go back and look at it and bring it right up until this recruiting class that Fran Brown is building for Syracuse football. So this episode is 2020. We'll also have an episode for 2021, and then next week, 2022. And 2023. We've also got some great episodes in the can, as we like to say in the business, in the can. If you haven't listened to recently, I would highly encourage you to check out our all-time Syracuse basketball starting 5 draft. Eric Devendorf, Frankie Saraceno, and I got together and we drafted our all-time Syracuse basketball starting 5 plus 1, added a bench guy to that list. And Frankie is one of our Syracuse Sports Insiders. That is one of the great benefits of being a Syracuse Sports Insider is you get to hop on podcasts like that one we did. Your insight, your opinion, your questions, all sent to me directly. You can text me at 315-847-3895. That is one of the cool benefits of being a Syracuse Sports Insider. Your voice heard on this podcast, direct line to me for anything you want to know about Syracuse sports. We keep you in the loop on what's going on, what's coming up on the podcast, and getting your feedback on that. So we had that podcast, had a great conversation recently with Ariel Elwani, who is the Woj. He is the Adam Schefter. He is the guy when it comes to coverage of MMA, UFC. Would that ever come to the Dome, by the way? One of the questions that we asked Ariel, who is a Syracuse grad, has a very unique story to tell. So I hope you could check out that podcast as well. And our Syracuse Sports Insiders always offering great feedback and great questions. So before Emily and I take over here in a minute and get into 2020, I threw this out to our Syracuse Sports Insiders, and I thought Jack W. sets us up well here when he says, bottom line, for 2020 and 2021, we were able to get decent, if not exceptional, skill position players, do okay with defensive backs and linebackers, but failed mightily in the trenches, which is one of the reasons why Syracuse faded as this season progressed. I hope some of the mountains that Fran has brought in to fill the trenches can actually play football. So with that as a setup, and thank you, Jack, for that and all of our feedback from our Syracuse Sports Insiders, let's get to it. Emily Leiker and I revisit the 2020 recruiting class, who was overvalued, undervalued, and everything in between. Some interesting names to go back on here. Let's do it. So, Emily, our little exercise begins in 2020, an interesting year by a lot of measures here. And it was an interesting year for Syracuse football recruiting and some of these names that we're going to go over here and where they ended up. So I'm just going to go down the list here, and we're going to remind people about what their star ranking was, what their ranking was, where they ended up. Did they graduate from Syracuse? Did they transfer from Syracuse? And the whole thing. And then we're going to assign them either overvalued, kind of met expectation, or maybe undervalued. And if we want to restar them, I'm sure there's a few guys that will deserve the reclassification. If we could see into the future at that time and see what kind of players they would be, that will give them a new star ranking as well. So I'm just going to go down the list here. I've got 247's composite rankings ahead of me. I'm just going to go through the names here and jar the memories of the listeners and the viewers here of who was on the list. Stephen Mahar Jr. from Aquinas in Rochester. He was a 3-star player for the Orange. 6'5", 225 tight end. Looked pretty good on paper coming in.
Yeah, and he was for a couple years. He is one of the later departures from this group. Tore his ACL in fall camp of, I think, this past year. Yeah, 2023. So that was a blow to him. And he transferred, but I don't believe he has found a new destination yet.
So that's kind of almost incomplete. I don't know if that's overvalued. He certainly didn't meet expectation. I don't know if we could put an undervalued on there. We're adding a fourth category on the fly here. There's kind of an incomplete. Some guys just, for whatever reasons, don't pan out one way or the other. So we'll put him in that category. How about that? Garth Barclay, offensive tackle, comes in from York Suburban in Pennsylvania, 6'7", 250, three-star player, rated 63rd at his position, 8th in the state of Pennsylvania at the time.
I mean, he's in my overvalued category, just because I do recognize this name. This is one of the few undervalued or overvalued names that I did recognize when going through this list, because of course this class was here slightly before I arrived. But I mean, you look at his size, like 6'7", like that. You think that's like a prime offensive tackle size. Like he should have been playing. He should have been doing stuff. He doesn't quite have the weight at only 250.
Yeah.
8 in Pennsylvania. I don't know what Pennsylvania's recruiting class looked like that season, but certainly this feels like a little bit of an overvalue situation. I don't believe he ever played for Syracuse, or at least didn't play significant minutes. So definitely an overvalued situation.
All right, Ben LaBrosse comes in from Montreal, Canadian recruit. He was a safety, 6'2", 200. He was a three-star guy. Now, Canadian players are rated differently, so keep that in mind, but he was second in his state, if you will, in Canada, and 63rd at his position. And that's one of those kind of, oh yeah, names. Got on the field, but didn't quite make the impact in his time at Syracuse, so we would probably put him in the overvalued category.
Yeah, I mean, he was gone before I arrived, so I really have no name recognition with him, but I would agree.
Okay. Rob Hanna, safety from Miami, 6 feet, 170 pounds, three-star guy, 67th at his position, 87th in the state of Florida coming in. And look, this was, 2020. You're coming off the 2018 10-win season, the 2019 season when Tommy DeVito was handed the reins. Things didn't quite go the way people thought they would. There was a lot of conversations about Florida and getting those. It's always a conversation, right? But Syracuse, to get any player from Florida, you certainly had to be in that conversation. I remember a little buzz about Hanna. I remember people being excited about bringing in a safety from the Miami area. And again, that's a name that I think you recognize, but what kind of impact did he really make? That's up for debate.
He had a pretty good 2022 season, if I remember. He had a forced fumble. That's what I'm remembering. I was going to say, I know he made a flashy play that got some attention that first season I was here.
He got out there.
I had him in the net expectations category. Like a three-star to me is like someone who does get on the field, maybe occasionally makes a play, but isn't necessarily a depth chart player or isn't necessarily like a consistent contributor. Like they're there and they're valuable for you to have rostered, but they're not a 4 or a 5-star. They're not someone who's consistently playing and consistently doing things for you. And so I think that was the case with him. It would have been interesting maybe if he was here a little bit longer and stayed with that safety room. Of course, you had Jason Simmons Jr. come in and replace him, and Elijah Clark was in that safety room after him. But yeah, and Rob, I believe, just left the program. I don't know if there was a formal entry into the transfer portal ever. I believe he was right. Just one of those names that kind of slipped off the roster.
But you recognize it's an guy, and I feel like met expectations is spot on. 3 stars. You remember to play. That's always good when you can pop and like, oh yeah, he made that play. He's on the field in a crowded secondary, and I think you got what you needed out of him. Mm-hmm. Kevin Lemieux from Byfield, Massachusetts, Governor's Academy, 6'4", 235-pound defensive end, 41st at his position, 8th in the state, probably in the incomplete category because just not a name you heard a lot about, and frankly, I don't recognize looking back at some of the guys on this list. So now we're going to get into the meat of the matter here. Now, you've heard some names, your memory's like, okay, all right. Now we're going to into the dudes. All right. And it starts right here, Emily. Sean Tucker. I've heard of this young man. Calvert Hall College, Towson, Maryland, 5'10", 190 pounds coming in, 3 stars, 59th at his position, 27th in the state of Maryland, went on to become the 3rd all-time leading rusher in Syracuse history with 3,182 yards, set the single-season rushing record with just under 1,500 yards in 2021. I think this guy worked out okay, and I think he was pretty undervalued coming in. And I think the big question is, do we just slap a 5-star on him, considering what he accomplished at Syracuse? I don't think I'm going to get much pushback on that.
Yeah, just for the sake of playing devil's advocate on a podcast, right? Which I will. Like, I think you could argue that his final season and the fact that there was a drop off there and it just wasn't as productive as I think everyone had hoped after the 2021 year maybe keeps him still down at a 4. Like, there was just some inconsistency in that. Now, obviously, then you weigh in the fact that he had something medical going on, or at least had something medical that happened after the season and then came up in his combine testing. So, like, I think there's an argument that maybe he's not quite a 5-star, but also, like, I think it's perfectly acceptable to rate him as a 5-star, and he is by far probably one of the most undervalued players in this class, and maybe in all of the classes that we're going to look at.
And the reason I bump him up to a 5-star is kind of some intangibles. You did that at Syracuse, and you did that at the running back position, which we have these conversations so often today about speaking of value, what's the value of the running back in the game of football, let alone college football, the emphasis on the passing game. Who wants to grow up to be a running back anymore? It just feels like that list is short. He was dedicated to the craft. He came in and set the records that he did. He was the centerpiece of an offense, which you can argue is not a good thing in 2021, 2022, because, you want the focus on the passing game and, kind of what Jeff Nixon is putting in now, the pro-style offense that Syracuse has. There's a lot of buzz about the quarterback and the wide receivers. But, man, I felt old school. And to do that at Syracuse with the lineage of running backs, I get it was different in Jim Brown's day and Floyd Little's day in terms of eligibility and how the offenses were. I get all that. But you're telling me I got this kid from Maryland who, let me go back to it here, he was ranked what? 59th at his position, 27th in the state, and he set those records at Syracuse University? Come on. I'm giving you a 5-star for that.
And was one of the top running backs in the country, too, like both of those seasons. Even in 2022, he was still, like, pretty firmly in the top 25. Like, I mean, I kept track of where his stats were nationally every week that season, and he was right up there with big names. And, of course, is still in the NFL now, so.
This is an interesting one, Emily. Jihad Carter comes in from North Carolina, 6 feet, 185 pounds, 3-star prospect. Now, he's bounced around a little bit. He was productive at Syracuse enough that Ohio State took a look, brought him in. He got kind of swept up at Ohio State because it's Ohio State and you're at one of the top level programs in the country with some of the top talent in the country. And now he's in the transfer portal era, coming back into the ACC at NC State, or maybe, and we're looking at the same situation here at Syracuse, maybe he pulls a Deuce Chestnut, went to LSU, didn't quite make the impact there at cornerback U, by the way, comes back to Syracuse where he's expected to make more of an impact here. I don't know what kind of grade to put on Carter because he's a good player. I hesitate to say overvalued because I think it's almost what he does at NC State will answer this question. I think he was a great player here. He just looked for another opportunity. He didn't quite meet expectation at Ohio State. So maybe I'll put the Met expectation level on him here because he was thought to be a solid player coming in and has been a solid player in 2 out of 3 spots so far, I guess. We'll see what he does at NC State. But I don't know. I feel like that's a guy I want on my team. So I don't want to say overvalued, but what do you think?
Yeah, I said Met expectations for Jihad. I mean, he had an excellent 2020 season at SU and then a really excellent 2022 season. That was the season that he had the 3 interceptions. Everyone was really high on him. I think looking ahead to 2023, people were like, oh my gosh, this guy's going to play a big role in the secondary next year. And then obviously he left. And right, I think what you're saying about like what he does at NC State is going to be the final kind of decision on it, because either Ohio State's going to be a blip, or it's going to be him leaving Syracuse fizzled him out a little bit, and he's not as productive anywhere else, and maybe he was just productive because of who he was playing alongside at Syracuse or whatever. So I think this next season will certainly be a better indicator and like a good final cap on that. And of course, he gets to face Syracuse this fall when the Orange make the trip down to Raleigh and face the Wolfpack.
Stefon Thompson's next on my list, Emily. Charlotte, North Carolina, linebacker prospect, came in at 6 feet, 222 pounds, 3 stars. He was 47th at his position, 36th in the state. He leaves Syracuse with 169 tackles, 10.5 sacks, transferred out to be with Tony White at Nebraska. I would say teetering on undervalued, but maybe met expectation. Because I felt like I remember hearing about Thompson. He could come in. He played pretty much every game at Syracuse, if I'm not mistaken. Just took advantage of the opportunity that's out there. He would have played here had he returned. He just wanted to be with his former coach at Nebraska, somebody he was familiar with. 169 tackles, 10.5 sacks. If you had told me that in 2020, that's what I'm getting out of this kid. I don't know if I'm bumping him up to a 4-star. I think he can make that argument because of the production that he had. So I'm going to say met expectations. I feel like he's a guy, that's what they recruited him to do, and he came in and he was productive, and now he's going to look like to do the same at Nebraska. But what do you think?
I gut reaction put him in undervalued, because I do think if he had not missed all of 2022 with an injury, with his torn ACL, the conversation around him would be a lot different. I think, like, I mean, obviously his stats would be so much more just because he would have a whole nother season of them. He was like expected to be one of the players for Syracuse that year. And then that was his first injury that he'd had, if I recalled. I believe he told me that when we talked last fall about it. And, you know, that first injury is always a tricky one, I think, for athletes, especially the older you are, because there are just like so many things besides just the injury that you have to work through, right? You have to work through the mental side of it. You have to work through like being forced to sit on the sideline the whole time and not work out alongside your teammates and stuff like that. And I think in his case, like, there was a little bit of like relearning to move and stuff like that because of his knee injury. And so like, I think if that injury hadn't happened, he's like firmly an undervalued. But yeah, I think he's probably a cusper between met expectations and undervalued given the circumstances.
Latari Kinsler comes in from Florida, 6'2.5", 204 pounds, 3-star prospect, 59th at his position, 134th in the state of Florida. I remember a little buzz around him, but, you know, I got to be honest, Emily, I lost track of young Mr. Kinsler. Where did he end up?
He landed at a G5 school. I didn't know which one, but he did transfer and landed at a G5 program. So he did go on to play after this, but did drop down a level. So I haven't been overvalued.
Overvalued and or incomplete.
Right.
Trebor Pena. Okay. 5'11", 180, 3 stars, 90th at his position, 31st in the state of New Jersey, where he came from, one of many Jersey guys, of course, currently on the Syracuse roster. He's expected to have a big role on this team in this offense. And where I think you put him in the undervalued category, Emily, is what he brings to the table special teams wise. He is one of the best kick returners in the ACC, and he's such a gadget guy. He's such a Swiss Army knife guy. He can catch passes out of the backfield. You can line him up at running back if you have to. You're not necessarily going to, given the players that are at that position. And his special teams prowess, I'm going to put him undervalued coming in, and I would bump him up to 4-star. And here's a guy as well, as we saw all last year. There's a little bit of a mystery because he was battling an injury. Had he not had that injury last year, we'd probably be hyping him up even more than we are at this point. But Fran Brown, Jeff Nixon, a lot of people in spring really loved at Kyle McCord as well, all with high praise for Trebor Pena.
Right. I mean, I had heard last season that he was like the second best receiver behind OG, and losing him was almost as big of an impact as OG. It basically was the same impact. Like, he just knocked out both of their top receiving targets. And so I think that praise coupled by the more recent praise and like you said, also the special teams of it all and the value he brings there, certainly this is higher than a 3-star guy.
Another receiver who has moved on through the transfer portal, Damien Alford, came out of Hollywood, Florida, 6'5", 210, 183rd at his position, 140th in the state of Florida. He leaves Syracuse playing in 42 games, 67 catches, 1,291 yards. That's 22nd all time in Syracuse history. So if you had told me in 2020 I was going to get a receiver at that size to come in with those numbers, I think we're tilting on the overvalued category here. But when you look at his numbers and his rankings, like if he had come in like a top 50 player and left with those numbers, maybe we're feeling more of an undervalued guy. When I say overvalued, it just, the feeling to me, Emily, is it never rounded out the way it needed to with Alford. He had his moments, and being 22nd all time at Syracuse in yards, that almost feels like a disappointment to me. When we saw Alford at his best, he should have been more of a prime target, and there was a number of reasons why he wasn't. So I'm going to tilt slightly to the overvalued category.
Yeah, I haven't met expectations, but I think that's reasonable. What I came back to was just like the lack of consistency, like with him. It's like exactly like you said. When we saw him at his best, it felt like there was a lot of disappointment around the rest of his game. Like I can remember some of those like leaping, amazing catches that he's made over the past 2 seasons, but it would be like one of those a game or 2 of those a game, and then nothing for 2 weeks. And I mean, obviously last season there's the pressure of, okay, he's the number 1 guy now, but hasn't built the number 1 chemistry with Garrett to be able to catch all those and all of that stuff. So I think ultimately, like he served in that role as well as he could, and that's why I have him in met expectations.
On to Justin Barron here, who, remember, came in as an ATH, 6'4", 210, 99th at his position, 12th in the state of Connecticut. He's asked to change positions, comes in, his numbers coming into a year where he almost entered the transfer portal with 1 more year of eligibility, but decides to come back, has faith in what, not to steal a phrase from Dino Babers, but has faith in what Fran Brown and company is doing. They talked him into coming back. 201 tackles career-wise. He's made 34 starts. He's a leader. He's a captain. I would absolutely bump him up to at least a 4-star, and certainly you got to put him in the undervalued category, all things considered. I don't think when Justin Barron walked in the door 4 or 5 years ago, people expected him to be what he is coming into this 2024 season.
Right. I mean, he's like one of the most firmly undervalued, but behind Sean Tucker and one other person that we're going to talk about in this class. Like, those are my 3 that it's like, these guys just like are absolute gems that Syracuse landed upon and was able to bring in. I mean, Barron's, I think the stat is that he's like one of the top 10 returning tacklers in all of FBS this upcoming year. And like just the value he's been able to add to the team. He did a lot of that last season with a clubbed hand, which was just insane. I think certainly, I mean, it just cannot be overstated. And I think the fact that Syracuse gets him back this year is going to be so beneficial for this defense, both on field, but also I think off field, because he is such an intelligent guy and by all accounts is really good at the X's and O's part. And so having him in that room for another year as you're transitioning a defense and bringing in a lot of new faces and a lot of young faces, they get that time with him as basically like an extra coach to learn this position and this defense a little bit better. And yeah, it's just all around a good situation, I think, for Syracuse. I
think the other guy you're talking about is going to come up here briefly, but Javonte Williams is next on the list from Bella Glade, Florida. 6 feet, 196 pounds, 203rd his position, 179th in the state of Florida. I think we kind of put him in the incomplete category and didn't pan out. And I have a sense this is the other guy you're talking about here, but I'll hand it off to you, Emily, when we talk about Marlowe Wax from Baltimore, Maryland, who, remember, I'm looking at it here on the list, came in as a running back, and they switched him, another position change. So he was rated 95th in the state, or at his position, 38th in the state as a 3-star running back prospect, and has become one of the more productive linebackers Syracuse has had. He has led the team in tackles in back-to-back seasons. If he leads the team this year, he'll be the first linebacker in 35 years to do it 3 straight years. He's played in all 49 games, 294 career tackles. He's second in Syracuse history in forced fumbles, behind some guy named Dwight Freeney, who, by the way, had 14 in his Syracuse career. Marlowe Wax is at 8, so he's still got some work to do to catch Freeney. But this is the all-time undervalued prospect, right? Comes in at a different position and becomes one of the more productive linebackers Syracuse has seen in recent memory.
Right. I do want to I'll take a moment and just like hypothesize what a Marlowe Wax running back scenario would have been, and just like that's such a fascinating thing to think about. And obviously,
really
it was a little bit like that with Justin, but a little different with Marlowe. But I mean, all the same things I said with Justin. Like, this is just a guy that adds so much value on the field and off the field, and you just can't replace the experience and the leadership that he has. He is also on that top 10 returning tackles list. I mean, right, he leads the team, so he's above Justin. If Justin's on it, then he is too. I believe he's number 2. I feel that 99.9% confident about that, but I don't have it pulled up. But yeah, I know he's a guy. I think the one thing that I've heard about him and his game that I think I'm curious to see this season is just there's a little bit of curiosity around like what he could look like in a different, more pro style defense. Obviously, the 3-3-5 was a very special sort of defense and required very special skill sets and all of that. And Marlowe excelled in that. I have heard from a handful of people that they're curious to see how he does in this more traditional 4-2-5. And they have played it some, and I think he'll be fine. But I think that will really open him up to a level of acclaim. I don't know if that's the word I want to use, but like acclaim that he hasn't seen before. Like, it's so fascinating to me. And I try to always like kind of like rationalize a little bit and be like, okay, well, obviously we talk about Marlowe a lot because we covered the team, but it has been fascinating to me that he hasn't gotten more buzz in the ACC as a whole, or even like the Power 5 as a whole over the past 2 years for some of the stuff he does. I do think it's because there has been a lot of really good linebackers in the ACC the past 2 years. It's one of the most competitive positions when you're picking preseason and postseason teams and all that. I mean, obviously, NC State had one of the best in the country in Peyton Wilson last year. He was an All-American. So I think Marlowe's going to make a big name for himself, and I think it will be beneficial both to him and to Syracuse that he came back again.
And like Justin Barron could have gone to the portal, could have gone to the National Football League, but decided to come back. And I think that star is going to rise even higher. I think the best point you made, Emily, was we have seen it day in and day out. Mm-hmm. Not only is he undervalued, he is underrated. And look, there's been some great linebackers in this league, but I think he's going to really take his turn. You mentioned Barron's numbers. I think Wax is up there as well in terms of returning production. You're going to see him on a lot of those PFF charts that cross your Twitter feed over the summer. And provided he stays healthy, of course, the Marlowe Wax legend grows in his last year at Syracuse coming up. Okay, a few more names to go through here. Josh Iloa, who came in as a defensive tackle, 6'3", 280. He was 122nd at his position, 61st out of Charlotte, North Carolina. What do you think is the story on him?
I have him as met expectations, right? I mean, he's been on the depth chart. He has played a little bit. And like I said earlier, I think a three-star guy is a guy who does see playing time and does contribute. It's just not necessarily consistently or in any flashy way. And I think he's a guy that does that.
I'm going to go through some names quickly here. Chase Atkinson, cornerback out of South Carolina, 137th at his position, 37th in the state. We'd probably put him in the incomplete category. Anwar Sparrow out of Virginia Beach, inside linebacker, who is 76th at his position, 32nd in the state. I mean, it's a name you heard. He got on the field. 3-star prospect, probably overvalued in a way, like maybe didn't quite get to where we thought he would, or maybe you disagree with me.
I haven't met expectations again too, because
That's fair.
He has popped up on the depth chart. He's still with the team, but again, that linebacker position where Syracuse has had a lot of depth the past few years, and just like he is just not quite the best out of those that have been in there, but he has contributed and been around as a backup guy. So yeah, I had him in that expectations.
Leon Lowry came out of North Brunswick, New Jersey, 6'3", 215. He was 94th at his position, 42nd in the state of New Jersey. What do we think is the category on him, Emily?
I think he teeters between met expectations and undervalued, because he did have a pretty strong season for Syracuse last year. I don't think it was like strong enough that you like automatically put him in the undervalued category or want to bump him up, but it made you curious about what he could do next season. Yeah. Obviously, next season he will not be here. He'll be in Wisconsin. So yeah, I had him teetering between those two categories.
And I remember when he transferred, I felt like he made some plays last year as a pass rusher that made you say, like, oh, that's too bad. He's not going to be around. And then you saw what Syracuse did in the portal and all the recruits they have coming in. So I think they'll absorb that blow. But that's a guy I remember definitely making some plays in the pass rush. Dylan Markowitz out of McKinney, Texas. Always interesting when a prospect from Texas comes into Syracuse. 62nd at his position, 256th in that state, about 6'5", 215. I'm also going to put Jacobian Morgan in this category here at 6'4", 200, 77th at his position, 53rd in the state. So when we look back on Markowitz and Morgan, what are we assigning them?
I think it's both overvalued / not enough data, right? Like Morgan was around. I think he was still rostered my first season here, but I don't think I ever saw him play significant minutes. Like he maybe popped on the field once or twice. Now, I guess maybe after last year and all of the quarterback woes of last year, you're maybe like, wow, it would have been nice to have another somewhat veteran guy around. But yeah, I don't know. I just don't think it moved the needle. Either of them moved the needle that much.
I agree with both.
In their playing time or their departures.
Morgan did, I forget what game it was, but he did have a moment where he got on the field. I believe it was in that 2020 season when they were just ravaged by injury and you're kind of getting down to those last guys on the depth chart and just never had that opportunity to grow as a player for a myriad of reasons. Max Mang from Germany, 6'7", 230, 131st at his position, 7th in his category. I mean, usually you go by what state they're in here, but he was, of course, a prospect from Germany who was an interesting guy. And I kind of want to say undervalued, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like Max, not, the greatest pass catcher in the world, but will come in and kind of do his job. And what was I expecting from him? Not a ton, but maybe met expectation would be there, or I don't know. You tell me. I like that he serves a role, right? Like I didn't have any expectation of him coming in, and I think he carved out a role for himself. That's kind of where I'm feeling with him.
No, I think you're right. I haven't met expectations, but I can see that. Like, and especially because really, like he's like their main blocking tight end. Yeah. Of course, they've taught OG and Dan how to block, but neither of those guys are natural blockers. They both have to work towards that a lot. And Max, that's what he was trained for. And so, yeah, I mean, I think
I respect what he does.
Undervalued.
Yeah. It's not the sexiest thing in the world, but he goes in there and does his job. I'll give him props for that. Mark Petrie from Iowa, 6'5", 265, offensive tackle, 34th at his position, 22nd in the fine state of Iowa coming in. And I would put him in a met expectations level, if not maybe a little undervalued. Started 11 games, played in 26 games, depth on the offensive line. Somebody that I don't think came in and you could say was hurting Syracuse on the field. I think he came in and did exactly what they recruited him to do.
From Germany through Iowa.
Right.
I had him as undervalued because I do think Yeah, he was rated a 2-star, which is different than a lot of these other guys who were rated 3 stars. And I think you could bump him up to a 3-star because, like you said, he did end up starting most of last season. He was the replacement for David Wohlabaugh at right tackle. And while there have been a couple offensive line additions since spring football ended, and I think that position is maybe still a little up in the air, like I think he'll land on the depth chart again, which is not something I would have said a year ago. But I think he will. So I have him in the undervalued category.
James Williams from Athens, Georgia, 2-star prospect as a kicker, 12th at his position, 287th. And, kickers are going to fall down the line a little bit there. Keep that in mind. I would probably say overvalued, right? Never really came in and grabbed that position by the horns. They've moved on. They've had different players come in since then. And there's a lineage there. You're being compared to some great punters. Sterling Hoffrichter went to the National Football League, is in the UFL at this moment, and Rob Long and the legend Riley Dixon. Like, there were some Syracuse fans were spoiled by some great punters in recent years, and kind of unfair to young Williams there, but he just never quite hit that level. So I'm going to say probably even at 2 stars, probably overvalued or incomplete.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We didn't really see much of him at all because they had other people come in, like you said.
So now we land on Isaiah Jones, Emily. It comes out of California, 6'4", 180 wide receiver, not rated. So you got nowhere to go but up from there. So you probably put him in the undervalued category, right?
Yeah, I mean, I did. I think of him kind of similarly to Damien Alford, only Jones battled injuries both of the seasons I've been here. That pretty much limited him the whole season. I don't think he played any more than like 4 to 5 games in either season.
But you were intrigued by him, right?
But you were intrigued by him. And I still remember like one of the first practices of 2022, we were talking about him because he had gotten injured in fall camp. And so we had asked Dino about him. And he was like, my wide receivers coach told me Isaiah is the best wide receiver we have on this team. And we just never really got to see it.
Yeah.
But it surprises me that he was unrated coming in as a recruit, especially out of California, which is a region that does get a lot of attention from these scouting agencies and recruiting sites and stuff like that. So you'd think they would have seen him somewhere. Maybe not, but I was really surprised that he was unrated on here.
Great kid to talk to, by the way. Really fun. And I felt horrible when he got that second injury because of what you noted, that the whole team and the coaching staff seemed to really be behind him. He just couldn't shake that injury bug. Jordan Allen, another California prospect, a linebacker, 6'2", 201. He was 73rd in his position, 114th in the state. What are we thinking, Emily? Incomplete on that one?
Yeah, it must be because he is just a hard commit and not a signee. So did he ever actually sign? I don't know.
It's not ringing a bell. I might be missing one or two with all these names we're reading here. But, yeah, I would certainly put him in the incomplete category. So now what's interesting is the focus is on recruiting, but they do list transfers here. And the more we go up in years here, because we're going to do 2020 through 2023, obviously this list gets longer. Just 2 in 2020, though. Cody Roscoe, who was 2 stars, and, of course, Chris Bleich, who comes in from Florida. He had to overcome a lot of injuries.
Yeah, Roscoe, I remember hearing his name, but I don't think was around by the time I got here. I believe he left again and went somewhere else. So I don't have a great read on him. He probably going by like overvalued / not enough data category.
I would agree with that.
But then Bleich, obviously, I think there's a case for him being undervalued. But at the very least, he met expectations, right? There were some foul troubles that he routinely got into a little bit, but
that's what I think knocks him back. Yeah, he
did eventually end up kind of trying for a chance at the NFL this spring and seemed to be a little in the mix of maybe a guy who could have been a free agent. He didn't end up being one, unfortunately, but I think he was valuable last season, certainly because of his veteranship, because last year was a really young offensive line. They've lost a lot of people from 2022. And so having him there, I think really helped anchor the rest of the team and the rest of that position group. Even though now, obviously, they're reworking the entire offensive line again. And I don't know how many of those guys
right.
that played with him last year are going to be starters, but it was valuable for the season. And when the offensive line played well last season, they did play better than I think we had seen them play in a couple seasons. But that was only on occasion, right? Like the Pitt game.
Well, Bleish is an interesting thing to look back on because he is a transfer. And when you're weighing transfers, like, okay, he comes from Florida, but he didn't play at Florida, but he was capable and recruited by Florida, right? So the transfer portal, as we know, has changed the game. You may be lost in the shuffle at a place like that, but you can play at Syracuse. He comes to Syracuse. He gets on the field for Syracuse. He had to overcome an injury situation, a medical waiver situation, really fought to get on the field here and did. And the thing that kind of, I think, knocks him into the overvalued category for me, as much as he went out there and gave Syracuse some depth on that line, is what you brought up, the penalty situations. I think he's just a guy who stands out there, unfortunately. So, but he gave Syracuse what they needed. They needed size. He's 6'6", 305 at the guard position. That's not routine to look on the roster and see huge players on the offensive line. But Emily, the offensive line, especially 2020, in back-to-back years, 2019 and 2020, they were one of the worst offensive lines in the country. And Tommy DeVito was the most sacked quarterback in college football in back-to-back years. So I'm trying to weigh it a little bit like, man, they needed anybody who could, parachute in and help on that offensive line. They get a talented guy from Florida who helped kind of get the ball rolling to get some other prospects to come in. You mentioned Dave Wollaba and obviously the transfers that have come in now to recruit better at that position. So I don't know. I'll say met expectations. I have an issue with the penalties, but I think you got to be fair as well. What were you getting from a guy from Florida, considering the situation Syracuse was in at the time? I think they got exactly what they needed out of him. It's just a shame he had so many penalties, but I don't think I want to tilt him into overvalue because I think he was somewhat productive in other ways.
I think that's a fair assessment.
So that is 2020. We will continue with 2021, 2022, bring it right up until last year in 2023 and the most recent recruiting class before the transition from Dino Babers to Fran Brown. For now, I'm Brent Axe. That's Emily Leiker. This is Syracuse Sports. We thank our Syracuse Sports Insiders, as always, for their contributions and their insight on all of our podcasts, let alone this one. Become a Syracuse Sports Insider today by texting the word orange to 315-847-3895. You can try it free for 2 weeks, and then after that, just $3.99 a month. So thanks to our Syracuse Sports Insiders. As always, for Emily Leiker, I'm Brent Axe. We'll talk to you next time.